Expectations become unbearable. Family roles harden into prisons. When a family's entire identity is built on achievement, failure stops being an option and becomes a threat. The Lemp Mansion was not just a home. It was a machine designed to produce heirs, reputation, and continuity. Sons were expected to inherit responsibility. Daughters were expected to preserve image. Emotions were not celebrated. Weakness was not forgiven. And inside that environment, cracks began to form. The first tragedy did not arrive like an explosion. Crept in quietly. Subtle changes in behavior. Long silences. Rooms that once felt alive becoming heavy with tension. In families like the Lemps, pain was not discussed openly. It was contained, hidden, locked behind closed doors. Because admitting suffering meant admitting imperfection. And imperfection was unacceptable. As years passed, the mansion absorbed more than wealth. It absorbed disappointment. It absorbed grief. It absorbed secrets that were never meant to be spoken aloud. The walls listened. The corridors remembered. The rooms witnessed moments that history books would never record. From the outside, the Lemp Mansion remained impressive. Tourists admired it. Neighbors envied it. Newspapers praised the family's success. No one suspected that the house was slowly transforming, from a symbol of triumph into a pressure chamber. A place where money could buy everything except peace. This is the cruel irony at the heart of the story. The Lemp family did not fall because they were poor. They did not collapse because of chaos or instability. They fell because they had everything except the ability to escape themselves. And the mansion ensured they never could. Because once you build a house like that, you don't simply live in it. You become trapped inside what it represents. By the time the first death occurred within those walls, the mansion was already no longer just a home. Before it became a house of death, before whispers of curses and suicide clung to its walls, the Lemp Mansion was a monument to success. It stood not as a warning, but as a celebration. A physical declaration that the American dream had been conquered. In the late 19th century, St. Louis was exploding with opportunity. The Mississippi River carried trade, industry, and ambition straight through the heart of the city. This was America rising loud, confident, and hungry, and few families embodied that rise more perfectly than the Lemps. They were not old European nobility. They were not inherited royalty. They were self-made Americans, built from beer, business, and brutal discipline. The Lemp family controlled one of the largest brewing empires in the United States. Their beer flowed through saloons, restaurants, and homes across the country. Money was no longer a concern. Influence was not a dream. The Lemps had arrived. And when wealthy families arrive, they build monuments to prove it. The mansion they constructed in St. Louis was not subtle. It was massive, ornate, and unmistakably powerful. Thick stone walls, towering windows, heavy wooden doors. Everything about the structure communicated permanence. This was a house meant to outlast generations. A house designed to hold a dynasty. Inside, the mansion was filled with luxury that few Americans of the time could even imagine. Carved woodwork, imported materials, vast rooms meant for entertaining important guests. This was not simply a place to live. It was a stage, a symbol, a fortress of success. And for a time it worked. From the outside, the Lemp family appeared untouchable. Their business thrived. Their name carried weight. Their wealth insulated them from the fears of ordinary people. While others worried about survival, the Lemps worried about legacy. But success has a dark side that rarely shows itself in public. Behind the walls of great houses, pressure accumulates. It was a container for expectation, regret, and fear. A place where silence grew louder every year. A place where success demanded payment. And the house would collect that payment in blood. In the next act, we follow the first cracks in the dynasty, how personal loss, unbearable pressure, and the illusion of invincibility began to collapse from the inside, turning one of America's richest families into prisoners of their own mansion. The fall of the Lemp family did not begin with madness. It began with expectation. In powerful families, expectation is heavier than poverty. Poverty allows excuses. Expectation allows none. Every son is watched. Every decision is measured. Every weakness is remembered. And inside the Lemp Mansion, expectation did not live quietly. It dominated the air. William Lemp Sr. had built an empire, and empires demand continuity. His sons were not simply children. They were future pillars of a business machine that could not afford hesitation. Their lives were mapped before they had a chance to imagine anything else. Responsibility arrived early. Pressure arrived immediately. And failure was never part of the plan. To the outside world, the Lemp household looked disciplined, refined, even enviable. But discipline, when pushed too far, becomes suffocation. Inside the mansion, emotions were managed, not expressed. Grief was endured silently. Anxiety was hidden behind routine. And any sign of vulnerability was treated as a flaw that needed to be corrected, not understood. The first major tragedy struck the family in a way that shattered that illusion of control. When Frederick Lemp, one of the heirs to the brewing fortune, began to deteriorate mentally, it sent shockwaves through the family. This was not something money could solve. It was not a business problem. It was human weakness, and that terrified the Lemps far more than financial loss ever could. Mental illness in the early 20th century was not understood with compassion. It was feared. It was hidden. It was treated as shameful. For a family built on strength and public reputation, Frederick's condition was not just painful. It was dangerous to their image. The mansion absorbed this fear. Rooms that once hosted celebrations became quieter. Conversations lowered. Doors closed more often. The house began to feel less like a home and more like a controlled environment where anything unpredictable needed to be contained. Frederick's decline was not discussed openly. Instead, it was managed behind closed doors, handled quietly, removed from public view whenever possible. But isolation does not heal, it corrodes. And as Frederick's suffering deepened, the emotional atmosphere of the mansion darkened with it. Then came the moment the family could no longer contain. Frederick Lemp took his own life. Inside the mansion, this was the first death that permanently changed the house. Suicide does something violence cannot. It doesn't just end a life. It implants questions that never stop growing. What did we miss? What did we ignore? What responsibility do we carry? And in families like the Lemps, those questions are especially poisonous, because admitting failure means admitting that the dynasty is not invincible. The death was devastating, but the response was even more telling. The family did not openly mourn. They did not publicly confront the pain. Instead, the tragedy was absorbed into silence. Life continued. Business continued. The mansion remained standing, elegant and unmoved from the outside. But inside, something had fractured. The house had witnessed despair, and once despair enters a place, it never fully leaves. After Frederick's death, the mansion became heavier, not haunted, weighted, as if the walls themselves remembered what had happened and pressed that memory into every room. Family members avoided certain areas. Certain doors stayed closed. Certain silences lingered longer than they should. And worse, the death did not end the pressure. It intensified it, because now the remaining heirs carried not only expectation, but comparison. They were measured against the absence of their brother, against the failure everyone pretended not to discuss, against the quiet fear that something was wrong within the family itself. This is how dynasties rot, not through dramatic collapse, but through accumulation. The Lemp Mansion continued to host gatherings, continued to project power, continued to represent success. But by the time the second death came to the Lemp Mansion, the house was no longer simply a witness. It had become a participant. After Frederick's suicide, the family never truly recovered. They pretended to. They continued their routines, their business meetings, their formal dinners. From the outside, nothing looked broken. But inside the mansion, the rhythm of life had changed. Conversations were shorter. Laughter became rare. And silence, long, heavy, suffocating silence, began to dominate the rooms. The Lemp family was still wealthy, but wealth no longer felt like protection. Felt like obligation. The brewing empire that once symbolized freedom now chained the remaining family members to expectations they could not escape. And the house reflected that shift perfectly. Large rooms became isolating rather than impressive. Long hallways felt endless. Bedrooms turned into places of retreat instead of rest. The mansion, designed to celebrate dominance and permanence, now magnified loneliness. Then came the next tragedy. William Lemp Jr., the heir expected to carry the family forward, was under enormous pressure. Not only did he inherit responsibility for the brewing empire, but he also inherited the unspoken burden of his brother's death. He was expected to succeed where Frederick had failed, to be stronger, more stable, more worthy. But pressure does not create strength. It creates fractures. William Jr. struggled deeply. The changing economic climate, the looming threat of prohibition, and the internal decay of the family weighed on him relentlessly. The brewing industry, the very foundation of the Lemp fortune, was under threat. And for a family that had built its identity entirely around beer, this was more than a business crisis. It was an existential one. Inside the mansion, anxiety replaced confidence. Meetings became tense. Decisions felt desperate. The sense of inevitability, the feeling that something was coming and could not be stopped, settled into the air like dust. And once again, the house bore witness. In 1922, William Lemp Jr. locked himself inside the mansion and ended his life. This was no longer an isolated tragedy. This was a pattern. 2 deaths, 2 suicides, both inside the same house, both tied to unbearable internal pressure. And now the question was impossible to avoid. Was the mansion cursed? Or was it simply amplifying something already broken within the family? To the public, the story became darker. Newspapers began to whisper. Locals began to talk. The Lemp Mansion was no longer just a rich family's home. It was becoming a symbol of collapse, a place where money failed, a place where success devoured its own creators. But inside the family, the response remained the same. Silence. No public reckoning. No emotional release. No attempt to break the cycle. The deaths were absorbed, buried under routine and denial. And denial, when reinforced by walls as thick as those in the Lemp Mansion, becomes deadly. The house grew heavier. Rooms where family members once gathered became avoided. Certain corridors were rarely used. Doors stayed closed. The mansion began to feel divided, not just physically but emotionally. It was no longer one home. It was many isolated spaces, each holding its own memories and fears. And the remaining family members felt it. They did not speak openly of curses or ghosts, but they spoke of discomfort, of unease, of a sense that the house watched them, that certain areas felt wrong, that being alone inside the mansion at night felt oppressive in a way they could not explain. Whether supernatural or psychological, the effect was the same. The house was no longer safe. And then came the 3rd death. Charles Lemp, another member of the family, also took his own life years later, again linked to the mansion, again wrapped in silence. By this point, the pattern was undeniable. This was not coincidence. This was not bad luck. This was a cycle of self-destruction playing out within the same walls. 3 suicides, 1 family, 1 house. The Lemp Mansion had become synonymous with death. At this stage, even those who rejected the idea of a curse could not deny the environment's role. The house had become a pressure cooker, preserving grief, magnifying stress, and trapping its inhabitants in an echo chamber of expectation and loss. The American dream had rotted from the inside. What makes the Lemp story so disturbing is not just the number of deaths. It's how predictably they happened. The mansion did not explode into chaos. It quietly consumed its occupants over time, one by one, as if waiting patiently. The family name began to lose its power. The brewing empire crumbled under prohibition. Money vanished. Influence faded. And the mansion, once built to symbolize eternal success, now stood as a monument to failure. A very specific kind of failure. The failure to acknowledge pain. The failure to change. The failure to leave. Because leaving was always an option. And yet no one did. They stayed inside the house that had already proven it could kill. By the time the last Lemp died within its walls, the mansion was no longer simply a residence. It was a warning, a structure that had outlived its purpose and absorbed too much suffering to ever be innocent again. In the next act, we will explore what happened after the family collapsed, how the mansion transformed from a private tomb into a public legend, and why its reputation as one of America's most haunted houses refuses to fade. Because some houses do not need ghosts to be terrifying. They already did their damage while everyone was still alive. By the time the Lemp family's dynasty finally collapsed, the mansion no longer belonged to them in any meaningful sense. It belonged to the story. The wealth that once protected the Lemps had evaporated. Prohibition destroyed the brewing empire that had sustained the family for generations. Money stopped flowing. Influence disappeared. And without those two pillars, the mansion lost its original purpose. It was no longer a fortress of power. It was an oversized relic filled with memories no one wanted to claim. The remaining members of the family drifted away, physically or emotionally. Some left the city. Some retreated into isolation. Others simply disappeared from public life. The name Lemp, once associated with dominance and success, became associated with something else entirely: death, silence, madness. And the house remained behind, standing in place as everything around it changed. This is the moment when the Lemp Mansion crossed a line that many historic homes never do. It stopped being a private tragedy and became a public object. A place people talked about without knowing anyone who lived there. A place that invited speculation. A place where imagination filled the gaps left by missing facts. With no family left to protect its reputation, the mansion began to absorb every rumor thrown at it. People whispered about rooms that felt colder than others, about doors that closed on their own, about footsteps heard when no one else was inside, about shadows at the top of staircases, about the feeling of being watched while standing alone in the building. These stories did not appear all at once. They accumulated slowly, like dust settling on furniture. Each person who entered the house brought their expectations with them, and expectation is the most powerful engine of fear. By this point, the house had a reputation, and reputation changes everything. Once a place becomes known as dark, every sound becomes suspicious. For some, turning the Lemp Mansion into a tourist destination was a way to preserve history, to keep the story alive, to ensure that what happened there was not forgotten. For others, it felt like exploitation, a way to profit from deaths that were never truly mourned. But the mansion did not care. It stood silently, allowing people to project whatever they needed onto it. Fear, curiosity, fascination, doubt. The building became a mirror. Visitors saw what they brought with them. Some left convinced it was haunted. Some left shaken but skeptical. Some left laughing it off. But almost no one left indifferent. And that is the true power of the Lemp Mansion at this stage of its existence. It forces a reaction. Because when you stand inside a place where multiple lives ended by their own hand, your mind cannot stay neutral. You begin to imagine the moments before death, the isolation, the thoughts, the silence. You begin to feel the weight of expectations that crush generation after generation. The house doesn't need to scare you. The story does. By the late 20th century, the Lemp Mansion had fully transformed into a legend. A structure permanently separated from normal life. A place people visited not to live, but to confront something darker. A monument not to ghosts, but to the failure of wealth to save human beings from themselves. And yet, the house still stood. It survived the family. It survived the empire. It survived the silence. Which leads to the final question. One that hangs over the mansion like a shadow that never moves. What does it mean when a house outlives everyone it destroyed? In the final act, we will confront that question. We will examine what the Lemp Mansion represents today, why it continues to attract people from around the world, and what its story reveals about America's obsession with success, tragedy, and the belief that money can protect us from everything. Every creak becomes a presence. Every draft becomes a breath. And the Lemp Mansion, old and heavy with history, produced plenty of natural noises. Wood expands. Floors settle. Pipes groan. The house spoke constantly. People simply decided what its voice meant. Over time, the mansion changed owners and purposes. It was no longer a family home. It became a boarding house, then a restaurant, later even a tourist attraction. Each transformation stripped away another layer of privacy and replaced it with exposure. Strangers slept in rooms once occupied by the Lemps. Visitors walked through hallways that had once been sealed by grief. And many of them claimed something followed them. Employees reported strange experiences. Guests described unease they couldn't explain. Some refused to stay the night. Others left early. Stories circulated about mirrors, staircases, and specific rooms that felt oppressive in ways that went beyond imagination. And whether those experiences were psychological or paranormal did not matter, because the effect was real. The mansion had become a machine that generated fear. But here is the critical point. What truly makes the Lemp Mansion disturbing is not the ghost stories themselves. Ghost stories exist everywhere. What makes this place different is that the fear is rooted in documented history. Multiple suicides, documented mental collapse, a family destroyed from within. The ghosts, if they exist, are secondary. The real horror is that the house did not need supernatural forces to become lethal. Human pressure was enough. As the mansion's reputation spread, it became one of the most famous haunted houses in America. Television crews arrived. Paranormal investigators set up equipment. Night tours were advertised. The tragedy was repackaged into an experience. And this raises a deeply uncomfortable question. By the time the Lemp Mansion entered the modern era, it was no longer simply a building with a tragic past. It had become a symbol, a place where American ambition, wealth, and collapse were fused into a single structure that refused to fade quietly into history. Most houses disappear when the families that built them disappear. They are sold, remodeled, forgotten, or demolished. Their stories dissolve as new lives overwrite old ones. But the Lemp Mansion never allowed that to happen. Every attempt to repurpose it, to normalize it, to turn it into something ordinary failed in one crucial way. The story always came back. By the late 20th century, the mansion's reputation had fully eclipsed its original purpose. People no longer spoke about it as a brewery owner's home or an architectural landmark. They spoke about it as the house where everyone died. The house of suicides, the cursed mansion, the place where wealth led nowhere but inward, collapsing under its own weight. And unlike many haunted houses that rely mostly on rumor, the Lemp Mansion carried documentation. Names, dates, death certificates, real people who had lived, struggled, and died within the same walls. That reality gave the legend a foundation that imagination alone could never build. As the mansion opened its doors to the public, as a restaurant, an inn, a destination, it crossed into a new phase of existence. Strangers slept in bedrooms once occupied by a family under unbearable pressure. Diners laughed and talked beneath ceilings that had once listened to despair. Tour guides told stories in hallways where silence had once dominated. And still, the house resisted becoming harmless. Visitors described an atmosphere that felt wrong even before they knew the details. A heaviness that didn't match the lively activities inside. Some reported sudden unease. Others described moments of panic with no clear trigger. By surviving them all, the house became something they never intended to build. A monument to the cost of unexamined ambition. Today, the Lemp Mansion stands as both attraction and warning. People come to feel something, to be scared, to be curious, to be entertained. But what they often leave with is something deeper and less comfortable. A sense that the story is not as distant as it seems. Because the pressures that destroyed the Lemps did not vanish with them. They still exist. They still shape families, careers, expectations. They still convince people that rest is weakness, that struggle must be hidden, that success must never pause. The mansion feels alive not because it contains ghosts, but because it reflects patterns that are still very much alive in the world outside its walls. And that is the final horror. Not that the Lemp Mansion is haunted, but that it does not need to be. It already proved that human beings, when trapped by expectations and silence, can destroy themselves more thoroughly than any supernatural force ever could. The house stands there still, brick and stone unmoved by time, watching generation after generation pass by. Some come seeking thrills. Some come seeking proof. Some come seeking answers. But the mansion offers only one truth, repeated endlessly through its history. We build houses to protect ourselves, but sometimes we build them so well that they become prisons. And once that happens, the walls don't need to move. They just need to wait. People who had never believed in hauntings left unsettled, unable to explain why the space felt oppressive rather than merely old. Skeptics argued reasonably that this was expectation at work, that people arrived primed for fear and found it, that old buildings make noises, that psychology fills gaps. And they were probably right, at least in part. But explanation does not erase experience. And the experiences kept happening. Employees refused to work certain shifts. Guests requested different rooms. Stories circulated about specific areas where people felt watched, where electronics malfunctioned, where sleep became difficult. Whether those moments were paranormal or psychological almost stopped mattering. Because the effect was consistent. The house made people uncomfortable. And discomfort is not accidental. The deeper truth is that the Lemp Mansion does not need ghosts to haunt it. This power comes from something far more unsettling. Recognition. When people walk through that house, they are forced to confront the idea that success can be lethal, that wealth can isolate, that expectations can crush from the inside, that a family can destroy itself without any external enemy. The mansion confronts visitors with a version of the American dream that is rarely discussed, the version where achieving everything does not save you, but traps you. This is why the story endures. It is not about spirits moving objects or voices in the night. It is about the slow violence of pressure.